In a lot of SaaS deals, the data processing addendum is treated like a routine attachment. It arrives late in the process, people assume it is mostly standard, and the real attention stays on pricing, liability, indemnities, and the commercial paper. But that is a mistake because a customer DPA can create very real legal, operational, security, and delivery exposure if it is reviewed lazily, and in practice some of the most unrealistic commitments in a SaaS deal are not always in the main agreement. They are in the privacy paper. So in this video, I want to explain how to review a customer DPA in a SaaS deal without overcommitting the business. The real question is not whether the DPA sounds compliant. The real question is whether it commits the company to obligations it can actually perform once the contract is signed. That is where serious review starts. Before redlining a customer DPA, the third thing legal needs is not a markup, it is internal clarity. You cannot review this paper properly in abstraction. You need to know what the product does, how the service is delivered, what the data flows look like, and which parts of the customer's wording are even compatible with your operating model. So, before I touch the draft, I want answers to a small set of basic questions. First, what is our role in the data chain? Are we acting purely as a processor for customer data? Are there limited activities where we may be acting as an independent controller, for example for account management, billing contracts, fraud monitoring, or project analysis? Or is the service model more mixed than the customer assumes? That matters because many customer DPIs are drafted on the assumption that the vendor is a pure processor for everything. That is often directionally true in SaaS, but not always completely true. And if legal accepts that framing too broadly, the company can end up contractually mischaracterizing activities that should be treated differently. Second, what categories of personal data are actually involved, not what the customer might theoretically upload, what the service is designed to process in reality: basic user account details, end user content, HR data, customer support logs, sensitive data, children's data, health-related information. This matters a lot because the broader the categories, the more aggressive the customer's expectations often become around security, assistance, deletion, localization, and incident response. Third, what sub-processors are already in the stack? Cloud infrastructure, hosting, support tools, analytics vendors, logging systems, communication providers, backup providers. If legal does not know this upfront, it is very easy to accept sub-processor language that the company cannot actually operationalize. Fourth, what security posture does the company already have? Do you have a standard security exhibit, a SOC 2 report, ISO certification, international control validated by your security team, standard breach escalation procedures, defined retention and deletion processes? If you do not know the baseline, you cannot intelligently push back on customer security language. And fifth, are there international transfers in the model? Where is data hosted? Where is support performed? Which group entities access the data? Which sub-processors are outside the relevant jurisdiction? A DPA review without transfer awareness is incomplete. Once that internal picture is clear, then the red line can begin. Now, when I review a customer DPA, I do not treat every clause equally. I focus first on the provisions most likely to create hidden operational commitments or unrealistic legal exposure. The first priority area is processing instructions. A processor can only process personal data on documented instructions from the controller, but in contract drafting, customer language often tries to stretch that principle into something much broader. For example, a clause may say the vendor will process data only on the customer's instructions at all times, including future written or oral instructions reasonably related to the services. That sounds harmless until you think operationally. If the instruction mechanism is too open-ended, the customer may try to convert the DPA into a flexible command structure that goes beyond the agreed service model. That is not acceptable. A cleaner position is usually to tie processing instructions to the agreement. So the documented configuration of the service and written lawful instructions that are consistent with the service and applicable law. That preserves the legal principle without turning the processor relationship into an uncontrolled operational obligation. The second priority area is security commitments. This is one of the most sensitive sections in the DPA because this is where privacy language often starts importing security promises the business did not mean to give. A common example is wording stating that the vendor will comply with all customer security policies, current and future. That should immediately raise concern. Why? Because it turns external documents, sometimes not even attached to the contract, into binding obligation. Worse, those policies may change over time without negotiation, without legal review, and without any confirmation that your systems or teams can comply. That is not a privacy clause anymore. That is an uncontrolled incorporation of external standards. A much more workable position is to commit to appropriate technical and organizational measures described either in your standard security exhibit or in a clearly identified schedule attached as signature. If the customer wants additional measures, they should be specifically listed and validated internally before legal agrees to them. A third priority area is audit rights. Customers often want the right to audit the vendor's compliance with the DPA. In principle, some form of audit right is normal, but the mechanism matters enormously. If the customer's draft says it may conduct on-site audits of systems, facilities, records, and personnel at any time, that is too broad in most SaaS contexts. It creates security risk, operational burden, confidentiality issues, and a precedent problem. A more controlled position usually looks like this. Provide recent third-party certifications or audit reports where available. Allow questionnaires within reason and permit further audit only in limited circumstances. On reasonable notice during business hours, subject to confidentiality, and without compromising the security of other customers or the integrity of shared systems. That is not evasion, that is disciplined scoping. The fourth area is breach notification. This is classic, a very classic point, where customers often ask for absolute timelines that sound good on paper and become dangerous in practice. For example, vendor shall notify customer within 24 hours of any actual or suspected incident. That wording is problematic for several reasons. First, any actual or suspected incident is too broad. Not every internal alert or security anomaly is a personal data breach. Second, a hard 24-hour clock may start before the company has verified facts contained the issue or even determined whether personal data was involved. Third, legal should never casually accept absolute timelines that the security function cannot consistently meet. A more realistic position here is generally notice without undue delay after confirmation of a personal data breach affecting customer personal data, sometimes with a defined outside framework if operationally validated, but not with language that forced premature, low quality, or over-inclusive notification. That point is critical. A breach clause should support disciplined incident response, not distort it. The fifth priority area is sub-processor mechanics. This is one of the most operationally important parts of the DPA and one of the easiest places to overcome it. A customer may ask that the vendor obtain prior written consent before appointing any new sub-processor. That sounds protective from the customer side, but it is often unworkable for a SaaS company. If your infrastructure, support model, or technical stack evolves, you cannot run every sub-processor update through a bilateral approval process with every customer. That creates friction, delay, and inconsistency across the customer base. The more sustainable structure is usually a notice and objection mechanism. You maintain a list of sub-processors, provide notice of new additions, and allow the customer to object on reasonable data protection grounds within a defined period. If the objection cannot be resolved, then the contract can provide a controlled commercial consequence. That is much more credible operational model. The sixth area is international transfers. This part should never be glossed over. If the customer DPA includes custom transfer language, unusual localization demands, or jurisdiction-specific routing that does not match your standard model, legal needs to slow down. For example, if the customer requires data to remain exclusively in one territory, the question is not whether that sounds privacy friendly. The question is whether the product, support, logging, backup, and engineering access model can actually support that promise. The same applies if the customer inserts custom transfer terms inconsistent with your approved standard contractual clause framework or group transfer mechanism. That is not a minor drafting issue that can affect the legality and consistency of your entire transfer position. The seventh priority area is deletion and return of data. Customer draft often say things like the vendor will immediately return and delete all personal data upon termination. Again, that sounds clean, but it may not reflect reality. Immediate deletion may be incompatible with standard retention windows, backup cycles, disaster recovery architecture, legal hold, fraud prevention records, or short post-termination access periods built into the product. A more realistic clause will usually provide deletion or return within a defined period after termination, subject to technical constraints, standard retention schedules, backup overwrite cycles, and any legal obligations to retain certain data. This is a good example of a broader principle. Privacy drafting should describe the real operating model, not an idealized one. The eighth area is assistance obligation. Customer DPAs often require the vendor to assist with data subject requests. DPAs, regulatory inquiries, records of processing, consultation with supervisory authorities, and other compliance steps. Some assistance is normal, but the scope must be controlled. If the clause says the vendor will provide all assistance necessary for the customer's compliance obligation at no additional cost, that is too broad. It creates open-ended service exposure under the label of privacy compliance. A stronger position is usually to limit assistance to what is reasonable and appropriate, taking into account the nature of the processing and the information available to the vendor, with the option to charge for disproportionate or customer-specific requests where appropriate. That is especially important in enterprise deals where privacy ask can expand far beyond the standard service model. Now, let us move from clause identification to concrete example of dangerous drafting. If the DPA says, vendor will comply with all customer privacy and security policies, the issue is not just breadth. The issue is incorporation by reference of external moving standards. A better position is vendor will implement and maintain the technical and organizational measures described in the agreed security documentation. If the DPA says vendor will notify customer of an incident within 24 hours, the issue is overbreadth and operational infeasibility. A better position is vendor will notify customer without undue delay after becoming aware of a confirmed personal data breach affecting customer personal data. Another example, if the DPA says customer may audit vendor systems at any time, the issue is uncontrolled access and operational burden. A better position is vendor will make available relevant third-party reports and supporting documentation and additional audit rights if any will be limited, reasonable, and subject to confidentiality and security safeguards. Another one, if the DPA says vendor must obtain prior written approval for each new sub-processor, the issue is administrative paralysis. A better position is vendor may engage sub-processor subject to prior notice and a reasonable objection mechanism on data protection grounds. If the DPA says vendor will assist with all privacy compliance obligations at no additional cost, the issue is undefined open-ended support exposure. Those examples matter because strong DPA review is rarely about saying no in the abstract. It is about converting broad customer drafting into language the business can actually support. That brings us to fallback positions. A good reviewer should not just identify problematic clauses. A good reviewer should know the preferred position, the acceptable fallback, and the internal escalation point. Take audit rights, preferred position, reports, certifications, and control written responses. Acceptable fallback, limited audit rights on notice in exceptional cases with strict conditions. Escalation point, open on-site audit rights into shared infrastructure on unrestricted access to security environments. Take breach notification. Preferred position, notice without undue delay after confirmed breach. Acceptable fallback, a short defined timeline starting from confirmed awareness if security validates that it can be met. Escalation point, absolute 24-hour notice of any suspected incident. Another example, for take-sub processor. Preferred position, notice-based mechanism with a posted list. Acceptable fallback, notice plus limited objection rights. Escalation point, individual written approval required for every new subprocessor. Thinking this way improves speed, consistency, and legal credibility. It also helps when you need to explain the issue internally. And that internal point matters, because some DPA terms should not be silently negotiated by legal alone. They should trigger escalation. For example, if the customer asks for security commitments not already validated by your security team, that should be escalated. If the DPA imposes timelines your incident response team cannot reliably meet, that should be escalated. If the customer tries to tie uncapped liability to DPA breaches, that should be escalated. If the draft includes data localization promises, segregation promises, or system architecture assumptions that product cannot guarantee, that should be escalated. If the transfer language is inconsistent with the company's approved cross-border framework, that should be escalated. The mistake is not just overcommitting externally. The mistake is doing it quietly in a way the business only discovers after signature. That is exactly what strong commercial legal review is supposed to prevent. So, if I had to summarize the correct approach, it will be this. A customer DPA should be reviewed as an operational risk document, not just as a privacy appendix. You verify the real data model first, then you focus on the clauses most likely to create hidden delivery obligation or legal exposure. You narrow broad drafting, you offer controlled fallback language, and you escalate any promise the business cannot actually support in practice. That is what disciplined DPA review looks like in a SaaS deal. And that is why this kind of work matters, because the real mistake in DPA review is not missing a privacy buzzword. It is agreeing to obligations the business cannot actually perform once the contract is signed.